Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hong Kong Student University once again. Today is the last day of our 3-day short course. Yesterday, we have been discussing a few interventions on expressive writing and affect labeling. So today, we will continue to look into other evidence-based practice. So I welcome you all again, and let's clap our hands to show a warm welcome to Dr. Keely. Dr. Keely, please.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to those of you who are returning, and welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. I see a lot of familiar faces by now, so that's really nice. It's hard to believe we've come to the last session of this short course. So today, I think actually as I thought about the title here, it's a bit of a misnomer because we're still going to talk about the brain and we're still going to talk about neuroscience. But what I really wanted to spend some time discussing today is the ways in which we're learning about how the body and how our physiological states contribute to our social and our emotional functioning. And I think in Chinese culture, maybe you all have had greater appreciation for this connection between the mind and the body, more so than we have in Western culture and in the US. But now I think there's lots and lots of very compelling research suggesting not only can the processes that happen in our brains and our social and emotional lives influencing what's happening internally in our bodies, but also changes in our bodily states that might be due to things outside of our psychological experiences can also communicate back to the brain and influence the way that the brain is working, influence our emotions, and influence the way that we experience our social environments. So I'm really excited to kind of talk more about the ways in which not only the mind and the brain affect the body, but the ways in which the body can affect the brain. So that's a lot of what we'll talk about today. Okay, so for today's discussion, we'll start with kind of this big philosophical question that I'm not going to provide a very compelling answer for, but I'll at least give you a little bit of insight into research that's been trying to understand for our mental and physical health, is it better to pursue experiences that cause us to feel good, or to pursue experiences that cause us to do good? So we'll talk a little bit about the neural and genetic pathways that link different types of well-being to improved health. And then in the second part, I really want to switch gears to emphasizing this role that the body and that bodily states and physiological activation play in influencing the brain and informing the brain about how to respond to the environment. So I'll talk about some really exciting research that's been looking at how reappraising or changing the way that we think about our physiological arousal might actually improve performance. So thinking about how the ways in which we interpret our bodily cues can either help us or hurt us in terms of our functioning. And then I'll sort of circle back to talking about a bit more of my own work where I've been looking at how alterations in the functioning of the immune system and activation of the immune system can feed back to the brain to influence our social and emotional experiences. And then I'm really hoping that there'll be plenty of time at the end for question and answer and discussion about the topics I'm going to discuss today, but also about all three of the seminars over the last few days, and sort of anything that, as you've had time to think and reflect upon the things that we've been talking about, that has cropped up. Okay, so to start with, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about different types of well-being and how different types of well-being might be influencing or represented in the brain and how they might influence the body. And I'm going to focus on these two different types of well-being called hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. Okay, so this is a concept that goes way back to Greek philosophy and to Aristotle. And they're sort of seen as these two different types of ways that we can pursue happiness. So one way is basically to pursue pleasure, things that are very rewarding and just sort of make us feel good. This is called hedonic well-being. So this is sort of the sum or the average of our positive affective experiences. So, think about something that you really like to do that just brings you a lot of pleasure, like enjoying maybe a really good meal. Or going shopping and buying something new that you really love. So something that's very pleasurable and brings just a lot of pleasure into your life. So this is what we call hedonic well-being. On sort of the opposite end of the well-being spectrum, we have eudaimonic well-being. And this is the idea that we might, instead of pursuing things that are purely pleasurable, that sort of purely bring about this sense of pleasure, we might pursue positive experiences that provide us with a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose. So this is more well-being that rather than tapping into kind of basic pleasure, that taps into our sense of fulfillment, that gives our lives meaning and purpose. So, this might be something like, going back to the couch potato from yesterday, maybe something like running a marathon, right? Something that it's hard and it's sometimes painful. It's a lot of training and a lot of a lot of time that we have to give up to devote to doing this, training plan to run this super long distance. But it provides positivity and contributes to well-being insofar that it gives our life sort of meaning and purpose and gives us a sense of fulfillment. So clearly, both of these types of well-being could be important and both could contribute to our physical and mental health. And a lot of research over the past few years has been focusing on basically which of these should we pursue. If we want to live the healthiest, happiest lives that we can, should we be pursuing experiences that bring us pleasure, or experiences that bring us this sort of higher order meaning and purpose and fulfillment? And what are the mechanisms? What's happening in the brain and in the body during these different types of positive experiences that might link them to happiness and well-being and physical health? So to give you a little bit more insight into what I mean by hedonic and eudaimonic well-being, on page 8 in your course materials handout, there's a questionnaire that's a survey that we often use to assess hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. So if you want to pull those out quickly and complete it, it's asking you to indicate the extent to which you've had these different feelings in the past month. So take a quick look at that. I think it gives you some insight into what we mean by hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. I'll give you a second to look at that. Okay, so people had a chance to check out the questions and sort of see. Okay, so let's go through each of the items and talk about what type of well-being they might be measuring. So during the past month, how often did you feel happy? So that would be an item that's assessing hedonic well-being. So the first one here, sort of how often have you felt pleasure, positivity? The second question, how often in the past month did you feel that you had experiences that challenge you to grow and become a better person? That's much more eudaimonic well-being, right? Positive experiences that provide meaning and purpose and fulfillment. Third one, how often have you felt satisfied with life? More hedonic, that your life has a sense of direction or meaning. Again, it's right there in the question, more eudaimonic. How often have you felt interested in life? More hedonic. And then that you had something to contribute to society, more eudaimonic. Yeah, exactly. So I think one thing that probably jumps out to you, or certainly jumps out to me as I look at these, is that they're not totally separable. Right? It's not as though you can't be high on eudaimonic well-being and feel like you have purpose and meaning and direction and that you're contributing to society and not be happy and not experience pleasure. That's not the case at all. In fact, often these two measures of well-being are really highly connected and highly correlated. So individuals who, tend to be high on one type of well-being also tend to be high on the other. So it's not as though people who pursue hedonic experiences necessarily are only out for their own good and their own pleasure and aren't feeling like they're contributing anything meaningful to society. And on the other hand, it's not as though people who are pursuing activities that really give them a sense of meaning and purpose and fulfillment are not experiencing happiness or pleasure. Certainly, those things go together. But you can look at them at least somewhat separately, or look at variability in people who might be higher on one type than the other, and see how it relates to health and well-being. And lots of research is now accumulating in adults, and actually even some in adolescents and in younger populations, showing that it's really eudaimonic well-being, this sense of having meaning and purpose and fulfillment. That's protective of health. That even in difficult, stressful life circumstances, if individuals are pursuing positive experiences that give them a sense of meaning and fulfillment, they experience some buffering. Their health is sort of protected. And more recently, researchers have started to ask sort of why. Why is this happening? What are the mechanisms in the brain and in the body that might be linking these eudaimonic well-being experiences to better physical and mental health? So sort of how is this happening? And one of the questions that my colleague at UNC, Eva Telzer, was interested in asking is, does differential activation of reward-related pathways in the brain, so similar to the neural systems that we talked about yesterday when we were talking about winning money and eating good food and giving support to others, so are those reward pathways during eudaimonic and hedonic experiences related to depression. So might we be able to get some insight into individuals' risk for or resilience to depression based on understanding their neural responses to these different types of positive experiences that vary in whether they're more hedonic or purely pleasure-based compared to if they're more eudaimonic. So to answer this question, Dr. Telzer brought 37 adolescents into the laboratory, and she scanned them using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI again, at time 1, when they were all about 16 years of age. And they, while they were in the MRI scanner, they were completing a hedonic and eudaimonic reward task. I'll tell you more about that in just a second. But they were completing this task that gave a measure of the way in which their reward system responded to both hedonic and eudaimonic experiences or decisions. And then she also measured their levels of depression. So how high was their depressive symptomatology? Then 1 year later, when they're now all about 17 years old, she had them complete the same measure of depressive symptoms again. So she's able to look at not just how depression at one time point is associated with their neural responses to these different experiences, right? But how neural responses at time 1 are related to change in depression over time. And this is really critical because a lot of what we're trying to do now with these neuroimaging or neuroscience techniques is to not just look at sort of how does the brain do X process, but how does the way in which the brain does X process predict an individual's functioning at a later time point. So can we use knowledge of how the brain is responding in one instance to predict, using the brain to predict behavior, psychology, well-being at a later time point? So that's what this design essentially allowed her to do, right? It allowed her to look at how is the brain responding at this time, and does that relate to change in depressive symptoms over time? Okay, so here's the fMRI task that she had her adolescents do in the scanner. So they completed 2 different types of trials. So this is a task that allows them to earn money for themselves and also to earn money for their families at a cost to themselves. Okay, so in the pure reward condition, this is a hedonic decision. They would see something like this, where it says on the left, it's the money they're going to get for themselves. On the right is the money that they would get for their family. So in a hedonic trial, a reward trial, they'd be getting, let's say, $3, this is American dollars, for themselves, and no change in money for their family. So this is sort of analogous to just the pure pleasure pathway, right? The pure reward. It's the hedonic. I'm getting money that could allow me to buy something that I want, and there's no change in money for my family. So they get to decide basically if they want to accept this choice or not. Unsurprisingly, most people say, yeah, I'll take that $3. There's no consequence to my family, right? It's more money in my pocket. The other types of trials that she had were these costly donation trials. And this is trying to tap into a little bit more eudaimonic decision making. So in costly donation trials, what would happen is the participant's family would gain money. So in this case, the family earns $5 at a personal cost to them. So they actually would be losing $2 if they decide to accept this offer, right? So it's eudaimonic in that the adolescent would have to sort of sacrifice the personal gain that they would get. They're giving up $2 that they would otherwise have in their pocket to go, buy whatever adolescents buy these days. And in doing so, they get more money for the family. Eva Telzer has used this task in a number of different studies. Interestingly, there are some cultural differences in the way that adolescents' brains respond to this task. So a lot of what she's studied is decision making in this task in Latino cultures in the US. So in samples of Mexican Americans compared to white Caucasian Americans. And Latino cultures tend to be more interdependent and more communal, and also have this strong sense of sort of family obligation. That part of being a good kid or being a good human being is contributing to the family. And in some of her prior work, she's shown that Latino adolescents actually show greater reward-related activity in the brain. So greater activity in the ventral striatum, this key reward structure, in response to gaining money for the family, even at a cost to themselves. Whereas the non-Latino kids, white kids in the US, tend to show more reward activity to the hedonic, sort of gaining money for the self. I don't know if any work has tried to use this task in Chinese culture, but I think that would be a super interesting project to do and to try to understand sort of if a similar process is at play. So she wasn't looking at, question? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, certainly. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about her findings, and this is where the neuroscience I think is really critical, is you can imagine that maybe people in more collectivistic or interdependent cultures would say, yes, I'll go through with this, right? I'll lose money for myself and gain money for my family, but I don't necessarily like it. Right? Like, I'll do it. It's part of my obligation. It's part of my cultural norms of what I should do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they find like pleasure or reward in it. But what the neuroimaging suggests is that actually reward pathways are activated when people, at least in Latino cultures, make this type of decision. So it's not just following the cultural script of this is what I should do. It's also, that the brain sort of responds in a way that's consistent with the fact that they might be experiencing more reward or more positivity. So I think it's really interesting and a nice question to answer with neuroscience. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The genetic and all of the combination of that.
Exactly.
I think.
Yeah.
A range of more closely related to.
Mm-hmm.
Even though externally, come on, but
Yeah.
here is.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Well, and I think the other thing that's really interesting about some of this work is that there's certainly variability. So different people respond in different ways. It's not as though every single person from a Latino background is going to show the same amount of reward-related activity to this type of experience, right? So looking at individual differences or the extent to which people show reward-related activity in response to these costly donations to the family might be related to their, sense of obligation to the family, or the sense of fulfillment that they get from contributing to the family is really interesting, because there certainly will be people who don't show that in response, to this type of experience, and for those individuals, maybe the cultural fit is not as good, and having to serve in this role of contributing a lot to the family could be more distressing as opposed to rewarding. So lots of variability and lots of interesting open questions in this area of research. So in this study, though, she wasn't looking at cultural differences. It was just looking at basically a measure, an index for each individual of how much did they activate reward pathways in the brain in response to these two different types of decisions. So how much did they activate the ventral striatum, this key reward brain structure, in response to pure reward trials when they were earning money for themselves, compared to costly donation trials where they were earning money for their family at their own expense. And which of those predicted changes in depression over time? So again, we're trying to use the brain response at one time point to predict change in psychological functioning over time. Okay, so here's what she found. So this is the difference score of how much each adolescent's brain responded to the hedonic decisions when they were earning money for themselves compared to the eudaimonic decisions when they were earning money for their family. So values that are over on this side means they had more reward to the hedonic decision. So more reward in response to earning money for themselves. People who are on this side had more reward related neural activity when they were earning money for their family. And on the y-axis here, we have change in depressive symptoms. So people who are above the line here showed an increase in depression over time. People who are below the line here showed a decrease in depression over time. And what you can see from this line, this negative association, is that individuals who showed more ventral striatum, more reward system activation in the brain in response to earning money for themselves, so in response to these hedonic decisions, showed an increase in depression over time. Whereas those individuals who showed more ventral striatum reward-related activation to earning money for their families showed a decrease in depressive symptoms over time. So here's that same graph just broken down. So now rather than comparing hedonic and eudaimonic decisions, we're comparing each one versus their control condition. And what you see here is again that for individuals who showed greater ventral striatum activity, greater reward system activity to the eudaimonic decisions, they showed a decrease in depressive symptoms over time. And individuals who showed greater ventral striatum activity to the hedonic decisions when they're earning money for themselves show an increase in depressive symptoms over time. So I think this is super fascinating and suggests that responses in neural systems that are involved in some of our most basic reward processes that are active in response to taking drugs, consuming alcohol, sex, good food. The extent to which individuals activate those same pathways when they're making these eudaimonic decisions to donate to the family at the expense of the self, are associated with declines in depressive symptoms over time. And interestingly, activation in reward pathways in response to hedonic decisions, so just purely getting money for the self, are associated with increases in depressive symptoms over time. So though I think conventional wisdom and sort of what feels like, at least to me a little bit, is out there in the culture, suggests that, it's really pursuing pleasure that's going to bring us happiness. It's, having money to go to fancy restaurants and on fancy vacations and to lie on the beach and, sort of experience these, pure pleasurable experience, that's what's going to bring us happiness and well-being. Really, the research is showing that pursuing experiences that bring meaning and fulfillment are actually more strongly related to health and well-being over time. And then it could be through these reward mechanisms in the brain that the extent to which people get reward and pleasure from pursuing experiences that provide meaning and pleasure that could be really buffering. So interesting, I think, and maybe leads us to think a little bit differently about the types of experiences that we might pursue. So I would argue that, what this suggests, at least somewhat to me, is that we really need to cultivate in ourselves and provide opportunities for eudaimonic experiences, pursuing activities that bring us meaning and fulfillment. And again, that's not to say that those things won't also bring us pleasure, because certainly they can. But it's sort of a different perspective than what's going to bring happiness is, eating at fancy restaurants and lying on beaches. I was also thinking, back to a topic that we talked about yesterday, maybe part of the ways in which giving support, providing social support to others, which I showed you some work on yesterday, that this is really important for health and well-being and that it buffers against stress. Maybe part of the reason for that is because these are eudaimonic experiences. Providing support to other people can provide meaning and fulfillment in life, again, to the extent that it's not chronic and on a volunteer basis. So maybe this is one of the ways that we can kind of do both simultaneously. We can give support to others, and that can therefore increase our sense of meaning and fulfillment. So one idea. Okay, so there's some evidence for brain mechanisms, right? That reward pathways in the brain might be one mechanism that links eudaimonic experiences and eudaimonic well-being with lower levels of depression. But what about in the body? So how does eudaimonia manifest at a molecular level? Can these experiences of eudaimonic well-being sort of reach into our bodies to influence which of our genes are turned on or turned off at any given time? So we're switching gears a little bit here. I'm going to talk to you briefly about gene expression. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about this emerging research literature, which is suggesting that our social and emotional experiences can indeed influence which of our genes are turned on and turned off at any given time. So I think generally we experience our bodies as pretty stable, right? They're changing maybe a little bit moment to moment, depending on if we're running up the stairs to catch a train in the subway or we're trying to stay awake in a lecture. But generally we experience them as pretty stable. And I think we're, taught to think of genes as this sort of, it's our genetic potential that we're born with that just is, right? But really, genes only change our bodies and our experiences to the extent that they're turned on, or to the extent that they're transcribed into proteins. And even though we experience our bodies as relatively stable, our genes are being turned on and turned off all the time, and our cells are regenerating all the time. And our genes and our physiology is listening in on the social environment and to our emotional experiences, and deciding sort of which genes to turn on or upregulate and which genes to turn off or downregulate based on the signals that they're getting from the social environment. So they might get these extracellular signals from the endocrine system. We talked briefly about cortisol yesterday, this sort of stress hormone from the sympathetic nervous system. And these are things that are released in response to social experiences, right? And then those signals get bound to receptors on cells that then can go into the nucleus of the cell and change the expression of genes, which then get translated into messenger RNA and translated into proteins that can go out of the cell and influence the physiological functioning of the body. And what recent work in this super exciting field called human social genomics is suggesting is that social stressors, so things like threats of eviction, of social rejection or disillusion of important social relationships, of exam or performance stress, can influence which of our genes are being overexpressed versus underexpressed. And generally, a set of findings is emerging to suggest that social stressors tend to lead to increased expression of pro-inflammatory genes. So I talked way back on the first day about inflammation and the important role that the inflammatory response, part of the immune system, plays in the body in responding to stress. So part of what stress seems to be doing is causing increased expression of pro-inflammatory genes and decreased expression of antiviral genes. So this means stress is sort of creating this situation at the molecular level where individuals are more prone to inflammatory diseases and sort of less able to deal with or to fight off viral infections because they have these down regulation or decrease expression of antiviral genes. So Steve Cole, who's been the real pioneer of this field, has called this the conserved transcriptional response to adversity, CTRA. Basically this idea that in response to stressors, both in early life and later, individuals show this relatively consistent pattern of greater expression of inflammatory genes and decreased expression of antiviral genes. Okay, I know that's a lot, but just take it as our social experiences influence which of our genes are turned on and turned off in this sort of consistent way, such that genes involved in inflammation are increased in their expression and genes involved in fighting off viruses are decreased in their expression. Okay, so now that we've sort of established that this pattern exists, that social stressors can influence this pattern of CTRA gene expression, researchers have began to ask, okay, well, what factors might promote resilience to this pattern of sort of problematic gene expression? Are there particular social or psychological experiences that might be associated with less of this type of gene expression where there's more inflammatory genes and less antiviral genes being expressed? As you might gather, given that the beginning of my talk I talked about eudaimonia, that's what researchers recently have been focused on. So this is work really led and done brilliantly by Steve Cole, who I mentioned is the kind of founder of this field of human social genomics. And then my colleague at UNC Chapel Hill, Barb Fredrickson, who's really a pioneer in the field of positive psychology. So it's kind of this beautiful coming together of someone studying these basic mechanistic biological pathways in terms of which genes are being turned on and turned off, and then a brilliant social psychologist who's really thought deeply about positive experiences and positive psychology and how they might be associated with health and well-being. So what they did in this study to examine if eudaimonic well-being might be associated with less of this pattern of pro-inflammatory increases and antiviral decreases in gene expression was they brought 84, these are healthy midlife adults, so ages 35 to 64, from North Carolina. And they brought them into the lab, and they had them complete that exact same hedonic and eudaimonic well-being questionnaire that I had you all take a look at. So these, 6 questions assessing the extent to which individuals have felt more hedonic experiences of well-being compared to more eudaimonic experiences of well-being in the past month. And then these individuals also provided a blood sample, which is how you measure gene expression. So they took the blood from these individuals, they isolated out the immune cells, and then they looked at which genes were more turned on compared to more turned off among their immune cells. So again, the finding from past research is that individuals who've experienced more psychological stress would show greater upregulation of gene expression in inflammatory genes and greater downregulation of gene expression for genes involved in antiviral. And they were basically wondering, would they see almost the reverse of that in these individuals who would report high levels of eudaimonic well-being. And indeed, that's what they found. So let me walk you through this graph a little bit because it's a bit complicated. So this is the kind of overall measure of conserved transcriptional response to adversity, CTRA, gene expression. And what you can see is that individuals who scored higher on hedonic well-being, so more of that kind of pleasure in life pursuit, showed sort of a similar pattern that we see to individuals who have experienced stress. So greater pro-inflammatory gene expression, lower antiviral gene expression. Whereas individuals who reported high levels of eudaimonic well-being showed the reverse. So rather than showing upregulations of expression of genes involved in inflammation and downregulations of genes involved in antiviral processes, when you look over here, what you see is that the individuals who are high in eudaimonic well-being actually showed greater expression of genes involved in producing antibodies and fighting off viruses and bacteria, and lower pro-inflammatory gene expression. Whereas those higher in hedonic well-being showed the reverse of this, right? Greater expression of pro-inflammatory genes, lower expression of antibody genes. So why does this matter? What does this potentially mean for mental and physical health? Well, it's interesting to think about, as I mentioned on Thursday, part of what inflammation does, and I'll talk about this more in a few slides, is potentially contribute to depression. So inflammation in the body can feed back to the brain to influence our depressed mood, our feelings of anhedonia, or sort of a lack of pleasure. And so what this is suggesting is that individuals who are higher in hedonic well-being tend to show greater expression of pro-inflammatory genes that could be sort of putting them at risk for these depressive symptoms, like that was shown in Eva Telzer's study with the adolescents. Whereas individuals who are higher in eudaimonic well-being are showing greater expression of genes involved in producing antibodies, which are effective for fighting off viruses and bacteria. And the idea here is that part of how viruses and bacteria get transmitted is from person to person. And so if you are high in eudaimonic well-being, perhaps a more social person, more connected to other people, you might be more likely to encounter viruses and bacteria because you're more tightly interacting with individuals. And so it would make sense, right? You would want your body to be prepared to potentially fight off those bacteria or those viruses that you come into contact with. Versus on the inflammation end, if you're more isolated, then you might want to activate these inflammatory genes that could help you fight off an injury if you're, attacked or something. If we're thinking about sort of the evolutionary history of this, it could be that in earlier times, being excluded from or ostracized from a group would mean you were at greater risk for being physically harmed. And so it would make sense to activate genes involved in inflammation that would help you heal if you needed it. So that's kind of the idea for why you would see this pattern of differential gene expression. So I want to briefly mention this follow-up study that Steve Cole, one of the authors of this eudaimonia study, did, where they really wanted to ask the question of what's a stronger predictor of people's gene expression? What genes are being turned off or turned on in their bodies? Is it loneliness, sort of this lack of social connection that we've talked a lot about over the past few days? That's a critical predictor of poor health, poor mental health, poor physical health, or eudaimonia. So both of these constructs have been associated with gene expression in previous research. Which one sort of wins out? Which one is a stronger predictor? So interestingly, what you see in the top here is that if you look at them both separately, you see that loneliness is associated with greater CTRA gene expression. So this means greater pro-inflammatory gene expression, less antiviral gene expression. Eudaimonia, similar to what I just showed you in the previous study, was associated with the opposite of that. So greater antiviral genes, lower pro-inflammatory genes. But then what they did is said basically, okay, what if I control for the other? So if I take loneliness and I look at all the variability in people's gene expression that's due to loneliness, but first, I take out all the variability in their gene expression that's due to eudaimonic well-being. So what's left over after I take out all the variability that's due to well-being? So there's no longer a significant relationship. So if I control for people's eudaimonic well-being, loneliness no longer predicts their gene expression. On the other hand, if I take people's gene expression, I remove the variability that's due to their loneliness, and I see what's left over due to their eudaimonic well-being, there's still this strong relationship. So this is some evidence for the idea that perhaps eudaimonic well-being is a stronger predictor of which of our genes are being turned on or turned off than loneliness, which is pretty impactful given all of the work that I've showed you previously about how important social connections are for our health and well-being. So these two studies kind of come together to suggest that eudaimonia is associated with a sort of more adaptive pattern of gene expression compared to hedonic well-being. And that eudaimonic well-being is a stronger predictor of people's gene expression than loneliness. And I think this has really important intervention implications. So on Thursday, I mentioned, social connection, hugely important. We're declaring it a public health issue in the United States. But we don't know how to improve it very well. We don't have a lot of evidence-based interventions for ways to improve people's social connection. It's hard. We don't exactly know very well how to do it. But what I take away, at least partially from data like these, is that maybe what we can do is design eudaimonia interventions instead. maybe if rather than trying to get people to feel less lonely and more socially connected, we can help them pursue experiences that help them find meaning and fulfillment in life, that can promote health and well-being and sort of counteract any of the negative effects of loneliness and social isolation. I think it's interesting to think about, like I said, with the giving support, that maybe part of what interventions to improve people's eudaimonic well-being might be doing is actually making them feel more socially connected. So you're sort of killing two birds with one stone, so to speak, sort of getting people to feel more fulfilled and more have more meaning and purpose in life, while simultaneously making them feel more socially connected to others. So you're increasing eudaimonic well-being while simultaneously decreasing loneliness or feelings of social isolation. But that's a hunch, and I'm speculating at this point. And I think we need more research and more people to design interventions to get people to experience more eudaimonic well-being, and then we can kind of test these different pathways. There's some interesting research on gratitude and how expressing gratitude or reflecting on gratitude might increase happiness in this more eudaimonic way. So that could be one intervention technique that we could use to maybe increase people's eudaimonic well-being, decrease loneliness and social isolation. But we need lots more work in this area now that we know the importance of these two different factors. So before we take a quick break, are there questions or thoughts or comments on? Yeah.
About the loneliness, meaningfulness,
Mm-hmm.
and anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
all this.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
for
Yeah. And showing how it happens.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
I do have a question. I mean,
Yeah.
when you're talking about gene and when you're talking about also condition,
Mm-hmm.
although we couldn't find the depressed gene,
Mm-hmm.
but they are more sensitively in positive things,
Mm-hmm.
meaningful things into
Yeah. Yeah.
and I wonder average people
Mhm.
that we research on.
Right.
Is there any research on people
Depressed.
depressed and look at also we know that when a child is born
Mhm.
we have a very irritable
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and all those combined.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether that is also
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
It's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head of any work that has tried. I mean, certainly individuals who are depressed show this pattern of greater pro-inflammatory gene expression. I don't know of any work that's tried to intervene at the level of sort of eudaimonic well-being, because I agree with you. I mean, I think for individuals who aren't suffering from any psychopathology, who are sort of relatively psychologically healthy, that these interventions could be effective. But that, things are quite different, obviously, when we're talking about full-blown psychiatric issues or depressive episodes. So I mean, I agree. I wouldn't be willing to say that I think this is going to necessarily work in the same way or be as effective for someone who's struggling with clinical depression. But it seems like, at least for individuals, who are healthy but have, variability in depressive symptoms, that greater reward system activation during eudaimonic rewards predicts declines in depression over time. But yeah, I agree. I think it could be different in individuals with major depressive disorder, for example. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, let's take 5 minutes and then we'll come back for the last part. All right, thank you. All right. So in our last 30 or 45 minutes or so, I want to delve into this question about how the body influences the brain, and how our physiological states can influence our emotions and our perceptions of our social worlds. And like I mentioned briefly at the beginning, I think we're pretty people are getting better at thinking about this direction, right? And thinking about how negative and positive emotions can influence what's happening inside of the body. But I think what we tend to think a little bit less about is this other direction. So how do changes in our bodily states feed back to our brains to influence our emotions and our social experiences? And so I want to talk briefly at the beginning about a series of studies that I really love, that I think have some important implications for the ways that we think about our bodies as either helpful or harmful. I love this quote from William James, sort of the founder of modern psychology. And he said that the greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another. And really this idea that, we'll all encounter difficult, challenging, stressful circumstances, but that the way that we think about them can really influence the results of those experiences. So this is a couple of studies I'm going to tell you about by some researchers in the U.S., Jeremy Jameson, who's a professor at the University of Rochester, and Wendy Berry-Mendez, who's a professor at the University of California, San Francisco. And they really embarked on this line of investigation, asking if changing the way we're thinking about or reappraising our physiological activation during stressful or anxiety-provoking experiences can change not only how we respond to those experiences in the moment, but also change our performance in those situations. So kind of the initial starting point for this research is this biopsychosocial theory of stress, which says that there are, among others, kind of two dominant ways that people tend to respond to stressful situations, either with a challenge response or a threat response. So a threat response, I think, is what we sort of classically think of as stress. So it's when a person encounters a performance-based situation and perceives that the demands of the situation overwhelm their resources to deal with the situation. That sort of perception of greater demands than resources leads to the experience of anxiety, leads to a greater maladaptive physiological activation, and worse performance. So you can imagine, let's say, a person who you have two people who both are told at the beginning of a course that they're going to have to give a presentation. So, public speaking is an anxiety-provoking experience for most people. So someone who makes a threat appraisal has a threat response to that situation might think, oh my gosh, I'm such a terrible public speaker. I don't have enough time to prepare. I'm so busy. The demands of this situation are overwhelming my resources to deal with it. And therefore, I'm going to experience a lot of anxiety, have a lot of physiological activation, and probably not do as well on that presentation. On the other hand, people might have a challenge response to a stressful situation. So challenge responses are really the perception that certainly demands exist, right? I'm going to have to do this thing, give this presentation that's hard, that's going to be challenging. But I have resources for coping. I know how to prepare. I can practice in front of my friends. I can take a lot of time to make sure that I'm prepared for giving this presentation. So it will be hard. It's not like I'm going to be totally relaxed and chilled out about having to do this presentation, but I'm perceiving it more as a challenge. It's a hard situation, but sort of I can do it, as opposed to a threat. And challenge appraisals are associated with less anxiety, sort of lower physiological activation in some respects, but not completely. It's not as though people who make challenge appraisals are just like flat in terms of their physiology, right? They're still going to have some activation, but it's just more adaptive. It's helping blood get to the brain more effectively than someone who's making a threat appraisal. And they'll actually perform better on these stressful tasks. So lots of research has established that these two patterns exist, and they're associated with these differences in anxiety and in physiology and in performance. And so what they were interested in looking at in this set of studies is if we can change people's appraisals of or perceptions of their physiological activation. So we've all had this experience, I think, of your heart's racing, your palms get sweaty, maybe you're thinking about asking a question to a speaker, you're thinking about giving a presentation, or you're giving a musical performance or a dance performance, or whatever it might be, an important meeting with your boss. And we often perceive that physiological activation, that palm sweaty, heart racing thing as stress, right? As threatening. But what if we could change our perceptions of those physiological conditions to challenge? What if now I'm not seeing my heart beating faster and my palms getting sweatier as indicative of this is a situation that I need to feel threatened in, but rather this is a situation that's going to demand some performance of me, but I can do it. So that's what they were trying to study in this set of studies. So the basic research question was pretty simple. Can altering people's appraisals or their perceptions or thoughts about stress and the physiological responses to stress promote a more adaptive physiological response during the stressor itself and lead to less attentional biases to threat? So more specifically, they wondered, can reappraising our arousal as positive be an effective stress reduction technique compared to ignoring our physiological cues or no intervention at all? Okay, so to investigate this question in their first study, they brought 50, these are healthy young adult participants, into the lab, and they had 3 conditions for their intervention. So in the control condition, Just nothing happened. They read some neutral reading material and hung out. In the ignore external cues condition, okay, so sorry, I should say, everyone is told that they're going to have to give a speech. Similar to the stress task that I've been talking about throughout our sessions, they're going to have to stand up and give a quick speech to a panel of people who are going to be evaluating them. In one of the intervention sort of control conditions, people are basically told to ignore the external cues in the environment. So they're told the best way to reduce nervousness and improve outcomes is to just ignore the source of the stress. So when you're completing your speech, focus your attention on the X placed to the left of the evaluators. Sort of don't look and don't attend to the evaluators themselves. Focus your attention a little bit away. So this is a pretty tight control condition, right? They didn't expect this to be associated with better outcomes because there's actually no evidence that ignoring sources of stress is beneficial. In fact, it might be harmful if we're sort of suppressing our responses. So here was the key condition that they were interested in. This is the reappraising arousal condition. So participants in this condition of the intervention were told that increased arousal during stressful situations isn't harmful. Instead, our body's response to stress have evolved to help us successfully address stressors. And that increased arousal actually aids in performance in stressful situations. So arousal during stress is functional and adaptive. So if you have this experience of your heart starts racing, your palms get sweaty, that's good. That's going to help you. That's a positive thing. It's not something to be threatened by or anxious about. So then after participants were randomly exposed to one of these 3 different conditions, everyone did this evaluative speech task, and they measured their physiology throughout the experience. And then afterward, they also completed this task called the Shue task that basically is a way of measuring people's attention to threat. So if people are more attentive to threatening cues in their environment. Okay, so here's what they found in terms of physiology. So on the y-axis here, this is TPR, total peripheral resistance. It's basically how much resistance is in your blood vessels in your arteries. So you want this to be low because you want blood to be able to get out to your limbs and to your brain during a stressor. This is called cardiac output. It's basically how much blood is your heart pumping out. So sort of an ideal situation, right? During a stressor, think about like classic fight or flight responses. We want physiological activation. We want our heart to be effectively pumping. We want our heart to be pumping blood, but we want it to be pumping blood effectively so it can get to our organs and our brains. So we want cardiac output to be higher and total peripheral resistance to be lower. Okay, so in the control condition, so this is where participants aren't given any intervention, you see kind of the classic finding during the stressor, TPR, total peripheral resistance, goes up, cardiac output doesn't change or goes down even slightly. In the ignore condition, so this is the condition where they were, participants were told, just ignore the source of the stress, don't pay attention to the evaluators, focus your attention on this X. We see a little bit less, but still an increase in total peripheral resistance and not much change in cardiac output. Then for participants who were in the reappraise condition, who were told, hey, look, this arousal that you're going to experience during this stressor, it's not bad. It's good for you. It's going to help you. It's positive. They show this very nice pattern of lower total peripheral resistance. So their blood is more effectively getting to where it needs to go in the body, and greater cardiac output. So their heart is pumping more blood. So fascinating, right? Just the act of changing how you think about your physiological arousal can change how you respond physiologically during a stressor. All that's changing is people's perceptions of what to make of this physiological arousal that they're going to experience. Okay, turning to this question of attentional bias to threat. So how does changing our appraisals of our arousal influence our subsequent responses to threatening information? So in the control condition, individuals showed increased interference, meaning greater attentional bias to threat. They were more attentive to threatening words compared to non-threatening words. In the ignore condition, you actually see an even bigger increase. So people showed greater attention to threat, kind of this paradoxical finding that sort of trying to ignore threat in one situation actually transfers to greater perceptions of threat in another situation. But in the reappraisal condition, people did not show any bias toward the threatening information after the stressor. So again, just changing people's perceptions of their arousal and their physiology during a demanding experience leads to more effective physiology and less bias toward threat. So I think this is fascinating, and it really suggests this mind over matter phenomenon, right? That changing our appraisals of our body during stressful, demanding situations can have positive effects on people's physiological and psychological responses to stressors. So they show more adaptive cardiovascular responses and are less attentive to threatening information. So I think what this suggests is rather than seeing our bodies as sort of hurting us, if we can start to view our bodies and their naturalistic responses to situations as helping us, as facilitating our performance, we can really change stress responses to being more adaptive. Okay, so you might think this is all well and good, but who cares? This is a sort of artificial situation that we've created in the lab. We're having people do this speech that they don't particularly care about. Can this strategy of reappraising our arousal as positive actually improve performance in situations that matter? So to address this question, Dr. Jameson, Dr. Mendez, along with some colleagues, ran another fascinating study where they tried to look at if having people reappraise their physiological arousal could influence exam performance. So I think probably all of us here at some point in our lives have had the experience of taking a high-stakes exam, right? Whether it's, back in high school for college entrance, if it's an exam in an important course at university, if it's an exam for going on to graduate school or for a promotion within a company. These exam performance situations are super stressful. There's so much on the line. And a lot of people experience a lot of arousal during these situations. And so what Jameson and Mendez asked was basically if teaching people to interpret their arousal as positive could improve their performance on these high-stakes testing situations. Okay, so very similar to the last study, they did this very simple intervention where everyone in the study read, all right, so the goal of this research is to examine how physiological arousal during a test correlates with performance. And because it's normal for people to feel anxious during standardized tests, we're going to have you provide some saliva samples, and we're going to analyze those saliva samples for hormones that are indicative of your arousal. Okay, so everyone's kind of on the same page. People in the intervention condition, after reading this information, also read, people think that feeling anxious while taking a standardized test will make them do poorly on the test. However, recent research suggests that arousal doesn't actually hurt performance on these tests and can even help performance. So people who feel anxious during a test might actually do better. This means you shouldn't feel concerned if you do feel anxious while taking today's test. If you find yourself feeling anxious, simply remind yourself that your arousal could actually be helping you. Could be making you do better. So super simple way of changing people's perceptions of their anxiety. I was a swimmer when I was younger, and one of my swim coaches, way before this research was done, who didn't know anything about science, I don't think, but used to say, if you were nervous, it was good because it meant you were taking it seriously. And that was like this, I think, way of that he was helping us do this exact thing, which is that, you know, you're going to be nervous before a big race, but it doesn't mean that you're not ready or that that's a bad thing. It means, you know, it's good. You're taking it seriously. Same kind of idea here. Okay, so people went through this intervention, and then they took a practice. This was for the graduate record exam. So it's a big exam that sort of determines your entrance into a lot of graduate programs in the US. Not only did they take a practice version of the exam, these were people who were actually planning to take the GRE for real in their lives to determine where they would go to college, where they would go to graduate school. So they looked both at how the intervention influenced performance on this practice test in the lab, but also how it influenced their actual performance on the GRE when they took it within a few weeks of completing the study. Okay, so here's what they found. In terms of the practice exam, so the one that they just did in the lab, people who were instructed to reappraise their arousal, reappraise that anxiety that they might feel while taking the test as positive, as maybe helping performance, did significantly better on the math portion of this exam than people who were not given any intervention, who were in the control condition. No effects on verbal performance, kind of interesting, but significant increases in performance on the math section of this test, just by changing the way that people thought about their anxiety and their physiological arousal during this test. Okay, again, you might say that's all well and good, but what about, you know, actual exam performance when there's really something on the line? Very, very similar effects. So once again, people who'd been taught that anxiety is normal, in some cases is actually probably good, it could be helping you to do better, they showed better performance on the math portion of the exam than people who weren't given those instructions. People are randomly assigned to these intervention conditions, right? This is critical. We're just randomly flipping a coin and saying, okay, you get the intervention, you don't. And these effects hold even when you control for important things that you think might be confounds. So things like their undergraduate GPA, their SAT scores, so how they did on a standardized test entering university, and the time they reported spending studying for the GRE. So even after you control for all those things, just changing the way that you think about your arousal during stress improves math performance. Another thing that I think is really interesting is that this isn't just an effect of sort of relaxation or lack of arousal. So you might think, okay, if we're taught to think of our arousal as good, then it just blocks it. People are just less physiologically aroused. They're just, more relaxed. That's actually not true. So they find that people in the reappraisal condition, this is salivary alpha amylase. I talked about this briefly yesterday. It's a marker of sympathetic nervous system activation. People in the reappraisal condition actually shows greater levels of salivary alpha amylase, this sympathetic nervous system marker. So it's not as though they're just totally relaxed and kind of flat physiologically. They do increase, actually significantly more than people in the other condition. They're just not thinking about that as bad. They're actually thinking about, this arousal as potentially good and helping. So it's not something to shut down and to sort of be afraid of anymore. It's something that's good, that's going to facilitate my performance. So once again, thinking about our physiological arousal as helping us, not hurting us, as long as we appraise it that way, is really helpful. Okay, so I think this work is fascinating and really important, and suggests that this really simple and very brief intervention, teaching students that arousal and anxiety during test taking is totally normal and may actually help with performance, leads to better scores on a high-stakes exam that has big implications for people's lives in the real world. I think we should be doing this. I try to do it with my students all the time when I'm teaching. But in our classrooms, in our boardrooms, in clinics, elsewhere, teaching people that your body is here to help you, and that the arousal that you might experience during performance-based situations is a good thing, and you want to harness that. That's there to help you. It's not something to be threatened by or afraid of. It's powerful, and I think it can really improve people's outcomes. I do think it's important to think about the timing. When do we tell people this information? And sort of when might it help versus not? So, there we talked a little bit briefly earlier about, if people have full-blown clinical performance test anxiety, this might not be that effective. But for people within, normative ranges, I think it could be very effective. And I think, it's interesting to think about that the mechanism for this is adaptive physiological arousal. So challenge appraisals instead of threat appraisals. It's not shutting down the body. It's just saying that the bodily activation is good. Okay. Any thoughts on reappraising arousal? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if anyone has looked at that specifically, but I mean, presumably that's part of what people are doing, right? They get told this information from an external source, and then they're probably reminding themselves of that through kind of self-talk during the actual exam. I definitely think that's probably part of it going on. Yeah, good question. Other questions about harnessing physiology, the body being good? Okay, so I want to end by briefly telling you a little bit about some recent research that I've been doing. Again, going back to this, how does the body influence the brain? Focusing on the immune system and how inflammatory activation in the body might influence our emotions and our social functioning. So as I mentioned on Thursday, there's sort of this intimate connection between our social experiences and the way that our immune system functions. And specifically that proteins, shown here called pro-inflammatory cytokines, that are orchestrators of the body's inflammatory response, are responsive to our social experiences. And what I want to suggest here is that are physiological activation in the form of greater increases in inflammation leads to a set of symptoms that we call sickness behaviors. So, greater activation of the immune system has been shown to lead to a number of physical symptoms. This makes sense, right? Think about the last time that you were feeling kind of crummy, like a little under the weather, but not so bad that you had to like stay at home in bed. You're still going to go to work, or you're still going to go to school. You feel like a little under the weather, but you're not totally laid out in bed. So these proteins, these inflammatory cytokines, predict increases in physical symptoms like fever, fatigue, pain sensitivity, appetite loss, sort of all those physical symptoms that we experience when we're getting a little sick. And interestingly, they also predict a set of affective and social symptoms. So in addition to causing these physical changes, increases in inflammation in the body can cause depressed mood, can cause anhedonia, or the loss of pleasure in things that normally bring pleasure and reward, and can lead to social withdrawal, or sort of just withdrawing from our social environments. And we've been trying to understand a little bit more about how this works. So how do these chemical messengers of the immune system, these pro-inflammatory cytokines, how do they signal us to influence our brains to cause us to experience less pleasure and to socially withdraw? And specifically, what's happening in the brain when we're in an inflamed state that's leading to these changes? So we know that pro-inflammatory cytokines can cause depressed mood and perceived social disconnection. They cause greater activity in brain regions involved in processing pain in response to social rejection. And they cause greater activity in the amygdala, this key salience or threat processing region in response to threatening faces. And they might also lead to anhedonia. So in animal models, greater increases in levels in cytokines cause lower consumption of palatable foods and lower levels of sexual behavior. So things that would normally bring pleasure and reward, animals who are in an inflamed state are not engaging in those behaviors as much. And actually humans show reduced activation in reward pathways, reduced activation in the ventral striatum when they are winning monetary rewards. So what about social rewards? That was the thing we were really interested in tackling. How might increases in inflammation in the body influence the way our brains respond to positive social information? So we might predict, based on these findings, that people would experience less pleasure, less reward from social connections during an inflamed state. But actually, some animal research suggests that during times of sickness and inflammation, animals actually huddle more with familiar cage mates. They sort of become more connected to other animals who they're familiar with. And so there's really no human research in this area. So that's what we were trying to tackle. So just as a model for what we were thinking about, times of sickness. Again, you're still at work, you're feeling kind of crummy. And we know, and I think it makes sense that during these types of experiences, we might not want to engage in social interactions with unfamiliar others, or in social interactions that could not be positive or not be pleasant. So we probably wouldn't want to go on a first date, right? We probably wouldn't want to go to a cocktail party with a bunch of people who we don't really know. I think that makes sense. And it makes sense evolutionarily. We are, already in a compromised state. We're already sort of sick and inflamed. So we don't want to interact with other people who could do us more harm, potentially. But think about the last time you didn't feel very good, and how you might have responded to positive social situations. So this is my husband, Dave. And I think when I'm feeling crummy, I actually want to be around him even more. So it's not as though I'm completely getting no pleasure from social situations. In fact, I don't want to go meet someone new or go interact with a bunch of strangers, but I really want to interact with a partner, with a support figure, mom or someone along those lines. And maybe I might even be more attentive to someone who could be providing cues of care. So imagine this is a person who's going to give me some chicken soup. Not a support figure, not someone I have a long-standing relationship with, but someone who's providing some cues that I'm going to help you. So that's what we're really focusing on in this line of work. So does sickness, does inflammation lead to reductions in reward pathways in the brain to social situations generally? Or does it actually lead to increases in reward pathways in response to support figures and in response to cues of potential social connection or people who mean to give us care? I'm going to skip, in the interest of time, to our findings. So basically how we did this quickly was we brought people into the lab, and to induce an inflammatory response in the body, we expose them to an inflammatory challenge. So we actually, it sounds scary, but I promise it's not. We inject them with a little bit of the cell wall of the E. coli bacteria. So this causes a big increase in levels of inflammation in the body. People feel a little crummy, but it's totally safe and time limited. They feel back to normal after about 6 hours when we let them go home. But yeah, we need them to feel crummy for a little while so we can study how it affects them.
How did you get the ethical?
Yeah. There's a lot of ethical hoops to jump through, for sure. But they know what they're getting involved in. So they provide blood samples that we use to measure levels of inflammation. And then they report on their physical symptoms, and then we scan them, again using functional MRI, when levels of inflammation are at their peak. Okay, so in the first task in this study, they got social feedback from a stranger. This is similar to the task I showed you on Thursday, so I'm not going to go into all the details. But basically, they get feedback from an evaluator on an interview that they've done with us that we videotaped. And they get to see in real time during their scan what this evaluator thinks about them, right? So they see this mouse cursor moving around the screen, clicking on different adjectives, both neutral, like sensible, positive feedback words, like you seem interesting, and then also negative feedback words. So this is just to show you that indeed getting injected with a bit of the cell wall of the E. coli bacteria causes a massive increase in levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines in the body. So this is interleukin-6, one commonly measured cytokine. This is tumor necrosis factor alpha, also a common cytokine. And here are the people who are exposed to the inflammatory challenge. They show a big increase. People who weren't are basically flat. So just showing, yes, this does lead to a change in inflammation. When we looked at how their brains responded to negative compared to neutral feedback, we found that individuals who were exposed to endotoxin, who had more inflammation in their bodies, had much greater activation in neural systems involved in responding to pain and in thinking about others' thoughts and feelings. This is in response to the negative feedback, right? And I think this makes sense. If you're sick, if you're in a compromised state, you should want to be very aware of potential additional threats in your environment, people who mean to do you harm. And so your brain should be sort of on the ready, ready to respond to these types of situations, which is what we see. What about for the positive, right? This is what we were really interested in. What about when people were getting positive feedback, like you seem interesting? We looked at how activation in neural regions involved in responding to reward and value. And again, we saw increases among individuals exposed to this endotoxin, this inflammatory challenge, in neural systems involved in reward in response to the positive feedback. So people showed greater activity in the ventral striatum and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So this suggests that when individuals are in an inflamed state, they show heightened neural sensitivity to both negative and to positive social feedback. And I think this really was a call to the field of psychoneuroimmunology, the field that studies how the immune system influences social and psychological processes and how psychological processes influence the immune system, to say, hey, it's not that inflammation just causes people to feel less pleasure, to feel less anhedonia. In fact, they might show greater reward sensitivity to some positive social information. And this could be good if it's leading them to experience situations, be attentive to people who mean to potentially provide care. We find a very similar pattern when we have people look at images of their support figures. So we ask them to send us an image of someone who could provide care or comfort to them during a time of need. And we find the same pattern. People exposed to this inflammatory challenge show greater activation in neural reward systems in response to viewing images of their support figures compared to strangers. And that's greater for people who are inflamed compared to those who aren't. So again, what I think is so fascinating here is that it really suggests that the brain is listening in to what's happening in the body, right? It's the immune system is influencing how our brain is computing social information. And it's leading us to be more sensitive potentially to negative information, but also potentially more sensitive to positive information. And I think the implications of this are big, given that inflammation is elevated in a lot of chronic disease states. So a lot of people are sort of walking around the world, leading their daily lives in this chronic state of inflammation in their bodies. And that could be really influencing their social health and their psychological health more, I think, than we've typically thought of. So again, not just the mind and the brain influencing the body, but also the brain listening in to what's happening in the body. And for both good and bad, I think leading us to change our psychological experiences and our social experiences. So I guess I'm going to end on that note. I don't know if that's a positive note to end on or a not so positive note to end on, but this has been really fun for me. Thank you for being here. Yeah, thank you. I hope more than anything that you know you've taken away that the brain is playing such a critical role in all of our psychological experiences. And I think we can harness neuroscience techniques to help us figure out which interventions are going to be effective, how interventions are effective, why they're effective, and then also just for understanding our social and psychological experiences. So thank you so much again for being here. I will hang out for as long as anyone wants to talk to me. So if you have questions or you want to follow up, please feel free to come chat. And thank you again for being here on your weekend and on your Saturday. It's been great. Thanks. Thank you. Oh.
Yeah, please join me to give a big applause to Keely again. Thank you. Oh, I'll give you a high five, okay? You will see your honey soon. And also, we thank you for the support from every one of you, especially for those who have attend all 3 sections. How many of you have attend all 3 sections? Yeah, let's give them a high five. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think all of you agree that Keely is not only a great scholar and researcher, but she is also an excellent teacher. I think she can present some very hard and difficult neuroscience and physiological research findings in a kind of understandable and easy way. And I think relatively it's quite easy, yeah, better than Nicholson. And also, I think Keely's mentioned that in her disclaimer over the last few days, we would like to keep the dialogue between the researchers and practitioners among us. Because I think we all learned from Keely's that the social and emotional experience related and connected to our neurological and physiological responses that are good to our well-being. So I think from Keely's talk, I think we can see there are a lot of opportunities. And yeah, so there are several ways we can enhance our dialogue. First, from in your folder, there is a survey. Please take a few minutes to fill that out and give us some valuable comments. And the secondly, on the back of the survey, there is a schedule of our positive neuroscience series. Actually, we apologize that we should print that on the back of the poster rather than on the survey. But you can take a photo of that. Actually, next month, in the middle of July, we will have another short course on social neuroscience. But this time we'll look at how social neuroscience can change our behaviors from antisocial to prosocial. I know some of the audience here from Hong Kong Police. That's very important, I think. And then, thirdly, I think we have learned a lot, right? But we also have forgotten a lot from these 3 days. I think because Keely has prepared a very comprehensive presentation, over 170 slides. But we will get the permission from Keely's, and then we will send out to all of you, so you can review, refresh your memory. Yeah, you may get a little bit nervous when you get a PowerPoint with over 150 or 170 pages, but it's okay. That's good to us, right? When you get a little bit nervous, I learned from you. Yeah, and fourthly, lastly, we don't stop here. We hope we can keep the dialogue, and then we can keep in touch with one another. I think from Keely's talk, I think there are a lot of opportunities we can establish collaborations between researchers and practitioners to enhance our practice, to support the well-being of human beings, especially those are at risk and in needs. Yeah, that's the purpose of this positive neuroscience series. Okay, and thank you again for coming in these 3 days, despite the bad weather. But I mean, we are very grateful. Actually, the first day, the rain stopped when we begin the seminar. And yesterday, I think we got sunshine, right? Before the section. And today, we finally see the sun. Yeah, so thank you very much again. We hope to see you soon, maybe next month or in the near future. And we will stay in touch. And thank you again for coming, and have a nice weekend. Yeah. And Keely, hope you enjoy the visit in Hong Kong. Yeah. She's great. Yeah. And she will visit Tycoon tomorrow, right? Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks once again. Thank you. Oh, I copied already.
Oh, good.
Yeah. But actually, I even can't open in the email. It's too big.
I know.